All right, this morning, good morning, by the way. We are continuing our Love Neighbor series, and we're going to be looking at a text from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, beginning in verse 25 and going through verse 37. This will be a very familiar passage to many of you, and it reads like this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Please join me in prayer. Bless us this day, O Lord, with vision. May this place be a sacred place, a telling space where heaven and earth meet. Amen. I thought about beginning this morning with a whole bunch of statistics and stories about how isolated and lonely we are in our culture. And then I realized I probably don't really need to do that, because I think we all know it. As we've talked about various times in different sermons, and as we read about in the news media, we know that we live in a time when we are more connected than ever, but we are more isolated than ever. We have more ways to communicate with one another, but we communicate meaningful things way less, perhaps, than we ever have. We have talked before about how even our architecture and the way that our neighborhoods are built reflect this isolation. Gone are the times when neighborhoods were designed with big front porches where people sat out in front and knew their neighbors and got to know people in the neighborhood. Now our outdoor living spaces are in the back behind 8-foot privacy fences, and we pull directly into our garages and close the doors. And knowing our neighbors becomes much more challenging, and we become much lonelier. George MacDonald, the great author, said this: "The love of neighbor is the only door out of the dungeon of self." Love of neighbor is the only door out of the dungeon of self. It's interesting that the two greatest commands in two of the world's great religions are the same. And they are what we heard Jesus in this text this morning say. In both Judaism and in Christianity, the greatest commands of the law are to love God and love neighbor. And it seems so simple. But boy, do we love to complicate the simple. We love to find ways to make these commands not so simple. And one of the reasons, I think, is because these commands, while they are so simple, they invite and confront us with things that make us uncomfortable. And so then, in order for us to escape our discomfort, we complicate the simple command. Right? So what that looks like is this. We hear this parable, and we hear the commands, and much like this ruler who stands up to test Jesus, we find ways to ask questions that complicate things. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this. As this parable very quickly reveals, we have a way of, the parable has a way of confronting us with who we do not want to love. Right? I mean, this whole parable hinges on this great reversal that Jesus does. Because if Jesus wanted to tell the parable in a way that would have really resonated with his audience, primarily a lawyer or a expert in the law, he would have made the Levite or the priest the hero of the story, right? We all know this. But instead, he makes the hero of the story this Samaritan, who, if you can imagine, and I won't try to fill in the blank for you because our blanks may be different, but if you can imagine the person or the type of person that you would least make the hero of any story you told, that's who the Samaritan is in this context. So maybe for you, you fill in that blank with a Republican was coming down the road. Or a Democrat, or a socialist, or someone whose gender doesn't fit, or someone whose sexuality that we're not comfortable with, or someone whose ethnicity makes us nervous and uncomfortable. We all have these reasons why we are uncomfortable with the simplicity of these commands: to love God and to love neighbor. So, as we have been talking about this topic, this idea of love neighbor, you remember the whole reason why we are doing this series is because love of neighbor is one of our mission priorities for the next 3 to 5 years that we have established. Those two mission priorities for the next 3 to 5 years for us as a congregation are to pursue joyful wholeness together. That's building community together and growing in discipleship together as a community and growing in our relationship with God. And to love neighbor, specifically to focus that love on our immediate local context. So it would serve us well to ask the same question that the expert in the law asked Jesus. Because while it may seem obvious, we have a way of making the obvious not so obvious. We have a way of complicating the simple. And so we have to ask the question, and who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Now, it's interesting because we religious people are consistent, if nothing else. If you read church history, if you read the history of different types of religious communities, you will see some of the same behaviors that happen time and time again. And here's one of them. This, as I was looking at this question, and who is my neighbor, one of the sources that I looked at, it talks about how a neighbor, in the context of when Jesus told this parable, would have been someone, it would have been normally identified as a fellow Israelite, a fellow Jewish person, but also, because of Leviticus 19:34, it would have been extended to resident aliens living in Israel, but it would not commonly include, according to this author, Samaritans or Gentiles. Because we, as religious people, love to draw circles of people who are in and who aren't. That's the power of this parable, in case you missed it. Jesus just took the circle that the religious people drew and tore it open by making the Samaritan the hero. In fact, in one ancient Jewish writing, the author writes this. Listen to these instructions about loving neighbor. If you do good, know to whom you do it. Give it to the devout, but do not help the sinner. Do good to the humble, but do not give to the ungodly. Hold back their bread and do not give it to them, for by means of it they might subdue you. Then you will receive twice as much evil for all the good you have done to them. For the Most High also hates sinners and will inflict punishment on the godly. Give to the one who is good, but do not help the sinner. The reality is that very often we, as religious people, want to do exactly what this author did. Did you catch the move? It was towards the end. The author says, "For the Most High also hates sinners." You see, we have this tendency to want to identify who it is that are the sinners, clearly not us, so that we don't have to include them. We don't have to love them. We don't have to do the hard work, the intentional work of crossing the road and caring for them. Welcome, love of neighbor, doesn't happen by accident. And we know, as we heard this story, that neither does the ignoring of mercy and the love of neighbor. Welcome and love of neighbor doesn't happen by accident. A couple years back, we put up on the wall out in the Welcome Center, welcome in over 100 different languages, all of those languages spoken in this community. But brothers and sisters, that doesn't make us welcoming. We have to do the hard, intentional work of welcoming people and building relationship. And it takes intention, and it will probably cost us something. You'll notice that in the story, right? The Good Samaritan comes, he intentionally crosses to the man who had been beaten and robbed, and it costs him something. It costs him his own oil, his own wine. He puts him on the back of his own donkey. He brings him to the inn, and he pays and cares for the man with his own money, and then promises that when he's on his way back, he'll pay anything else that it requires. It takes intention to be a neighbor. The Samaritan used his own resources with no mention or apparent concern for repayment. Now, there's a lot to explore in this parable around the themes of otherness, the idea of how it is that we other people, right? I mean, we could spend time talking about religion and the religious professionals, and the way that formal religion oftentimes finds way to ignore mercy. Now, many of you may, if you've been around church for a long time, you may have heard this parable interpreted something like this, that the Levite and the priest, the reason that they could not that they walked to the other side was because to care for this man would make them ritually unclean, and they needed to be ritually clean so they could serve in the temple, right? Anybody ever heard that interpretation? Yeah, the problem with that is, if you read the direction of the story, they're not going up to Jerusalem, they're coming down, which means they're not on their way to serve anywhere, they're on their way home. Right? There's a lot to explore in that. I have another sermon on this text where the refrain that I use over and over again is that there is no other, there is only neighbor. Because this parable removes our option. We don't get to other anybody because everyone made in the image of God is our neighbor. There is no other, there is only neighbor. Jesus does not give us the option of who it is that we love and serve. But today, instead of doing that, I want to focus on the more simple act of neighboring. Because friends, and I will say this is true of myself as well, we have lost the art of neighboring. We, in some ways, because of our isolation, because of the way that we are as a culture right now, we don't even know where to start sometimes in how to build relationships with our neighbors. And so that's why we had the seminar that we had last week after church about living the good news and learning from one of our missionary couples about how to build relationships with people who are not like us. Right? That's why we play pickleball twice a month on Wednesday nights, by the way. Not because I love pickleball, which I do. Highly recommended as an entertaining pastime. Fastest growing sport in America, yada, yada, yada. That's not why we do it. We do it because the last time we did it, we had 22 people there and only 3 of them were from this church. We do it because it offers an opportunity to build relationships with people. Right? But we don't know how to do that oftentimes. And so this morning I want to follow and talk about learning to follow that simple command in our neighborhoods and in our daily lives. Because let's be honest, we can inadvertently make this parable about something else. And we can make it have less impact in our lives because let's be honest, how many of us have ever come across someone who's been mugged and beaten and we've poured oil and wine on their wounds and put them on our donkeys, right? We have services and ways that, we would call 911, right? But that doesn't remove the command or the call of Jesus to love our neighbors. And so in some ways, it's more likely that we get the opportunity to exercise or practice loving our neighbors in our everyday lives. That means that we have to figure out how it is that we can meet our neighbors. We have to figure out how to build relationships with people who are different than us. So I'm going to invite some folks up here this morning to do just a little interview because Shane and Angela Peterson have agreed to come and talk with me. And the reason I'm asking them to come and do this is because Shane and Angela, one of the first things I learned about them was that they have built really a pretty impressive network in their neighborhood where they live. And so I wanted you to get a flavor for what that might look like as you love neighbor in your everyday life. So Shane and Angela, please come. You guys welcome them because this is, it's a little different. We're going to do this Tonight Show style. We've got our comfy living room here. Thanks, guys. Come on up. And so Shane and Angela, we're going to just start by them telling you a little bit about themselves, like how long have you been at Kent Cove, family, that kind of stuff. I know you've got some big family news happening, so, you can share that if you like. Go ahead. Whoever wants to go first, I'm not going to call you out, so.
All right, I'll go first. So
Get it right up there, Shane.
All right.
There you go.
So Shane and Angela Peterson, we've been married for 37 years. We have 2 grown daughters who are married, and in the next week or 2, we're going to be grandparents.
Yay. And Angela, how long have you guys been here at Kent Cove?
2016 was when we started in the fall. So
Great.
7 years.
Okay, perfect. So now I want to talk just a little bit about how long have you lived in your neighborhood? What does that look like for you? Like, I know that you have a lot of different relationships and some events and different things that happen, but if you can just talk a little bit about how you got to that point.
Well, when we moved into our neighborhood, there was exactly like what you said. People pull in their garage, they shut the door, and we're just not okay with that. We wanted to connect, and it started really small. We, like the girls and I would make cookies, or we'd make pasta or whatever, and we'd take that to our next door neighbors, and we kept consistently doing that over and over and over. And I think you mentioned...
You made welcome baskets, so when new neighbors would move in, the first thing we would do is provide a welcome basket, get their name, number, and invite them to events that we were doing, or just little things. In fact, one time, it was a Friday afternoon, I came home from work, and Angela was out front sitting in the driveway with one of our neighbors. And over the course of the next 3 to 4 hours, we had almost 75 people in our driveway having food, and it was just this sort of perfect storm of events that occurred. But it manifested itself because of all the times that we reached out and consistently, were there for them, or shared with them. Like one of my gifts is woodworking, and so I would go help people with whatever projects they were working on, and we would share tools, and it just continued to kind of spool up.
Yeah.
Great. So talk a little bit about some of those connections as far as like the types of, because I know your neighborhood has a number of different events that you do every year, and maybe how you started those or how you were involved in those.
Well, initially we did all of the contact, and everything was held at our house. And like you said, there's a cost to that. It's your time and money, but it's worth it because you're building all of these relationships with not just our age, but as the families changed, we've got young little kids, so you go to the dollar store and you get bubbles and you get sidewalk chalk, and you have it, and the kids know where it's at, and you just keep inviting people to come and spend time in your home. And then what we noticed is when texting got really popular, we started a text string. And so now that text string is used to connect for everything. Like, hey, does anybody have this widget that I'm missing? Or I'm going out of town, can somebody watch my house? I mean, just all of those things. Or, hey, I'm gonna have a grandbaby, let's celebrate. Or somebody has a birthday. Those things just kind of all come together. And then what we noticed during COVID was everybody wanted to keep getting together, and we could do that safely outside and still have time together with people. And in doing that, other people now are initiating those things. And then after COVID, our homeowners association started a social committee. So now they organize, in addition to these little events, a 4th of July bike parade, and like a Halloween costume parade, and Labor Day potluck. And so it's just kind of expanded where people felt that they could, they trusted each other to spend time together, and they wanted to show up.
Great. So last 2 questions, I'm going to ask them together, so you take them however you like. The first is, how long did this take? Because I think one of the challenges, at least I know for, like Gretchen and I tried something in our neighborhood where we used to live, and nobody really showed up, and so then we didn't do it again, which I understand is problematic. But how long did it take for this to kind of take root? And then also any advice for somebody who just wants to start out? Like what's maybe one or two simple things that somebody could do to demonstrate love for their neighbors that you've picked up over the years?
I think it took the better part of a year, and it wasn't, if you think about it, it wasn't any one particular thing that we did, because each of those things in and of itself is nice, but it was the consistency and going back over and over, and the summation of that is really what I think kind of put it over the top, and they really felt like we cared about them, and then they started to care about us, and it was just so. But it takes time, and so I guess my advice would be just be persistent. Don't get frustrated like this isn't working, because it won't work right away. It just simply doesn't.
Yeah, the first Christmas party we invited everybody to come over for an open house, and I think we had like 5 people show up. It was easier to do things out in our driveway because I think people felt safer in that environment. They could enter and exit as they wanted to, and I agree with Shane. It's being consistent, but not with an agenda. Just consistently loving on them. Here, I have cookies or I have brownies or whatever, and use your gifts. Like his is woodworking and house stuff, and mine is the girls and I liked to bake, and so we use those things to connect.
Great. So could you say that one part again about agenda?
Yeah, no agenda. Yeah, because there's only us and another family out of the 17 on our text string that are Christians. We have Buddhists, active Jewish folks, and then everybody else doesn't really, they don't claim any kind of religion. And we can all come together, and those are things, we don't talk about religion and politics. It doesn't really come up. We're there to care for each other and empathize and be joyful, and hopefully someday God will move that and allow us to share the gospel.
Great. All right. Thanks, guys, for sharing. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yep. So, I think the piece that I really want for us to understand as we consider what it means to live into this call of Jesus for us to love our neighbors is the intentionality that it takes. And sometimes the simplicity of what it is that we need to do in order to build those relationships. You see, I think sometimes we talk so much about evangelism and doing evangelism in the church that we kind of like go this high level so that anything short of somebody making a decision for Christ doesn't count. But the reality is that we live in a context now that is, we're in a mission context. When I was in seminary, I think I said this the first sermon in this series, when I was in seminary, and this was 30 years ago, the United States was considered, I think, the 3rd largest mission field in the world. We know that in this community, this is a very different place than when this church was started in 1967. A very different place. And so the likelihood of us going from 0 to 60 is very small. In other words, we have to take the same approach that our missionaries take, and that is building relationships and getting to know our neighbors. And over time, building relationships where there's trust and love, and we get invited into their lives, and then eventually we get to share the reason for our hope, right? So we have to avoid that tendency to think that the only reason we're building a relationship is so that we can share the gospel. No, the only reason we're building a relationship is because this person was made in the image of God and we're called to love them. And ultimately, yes, we want to share the gospel with them. But our first priority is to love our neighbor. The other thing I want to say about this in closing is that this priority, the priority of loving neighbor, is not going to be achieved by a program. That's one of our other addictions, right? We want us to start a program so that we can point to a program that, a certain percentage of the congregation participates in as an example of how we love our neighbors. That's certainly part of what we will do. But what I'm more concerned about, or what I'm more interested in, is to make this a priority that all of us, as followers of Jesus, are seeking to love our neighbors more intentionally in our neighborhoods through our service to the community with ministry partners. Right? So we did a survey a little while ago where we looked at all the different places where the people, and it was, I think, about 50 people responded to this survey that we sent out that serve with various ministry partners in the community. And we will continue that work. But what I am more interested in at this moment is more basic. It's the call of Jesus for each one of us to love God and love neighbor. And so that's where we want to start. And I want to just challenge you to figure out ways to love your neighbors in your neighborhood, whether that neighborhood is in an apartment complex or in a retirement home or in a cul-de-sac or whatever, however it looks, wherever you live. Find and commit to following God in loving neighbor. One simple step. Find one way that you can try to connect and be intentional and be consistent. And see what God might do. It's interesting. Kelly, in her children's sermon, talking about Joshua and how Joshua's job was just to follow the plan. Brothers and sisters, the plan is to love neighbor. Our job is to follow the plan. Right? And so it's my prayer for us that as we seek to be God's people, as we seek to love God and love neighbor, that we would do it in our neighborhoods first. Because here's the thing. That is you being the church. Oftentimes we think that, well, if it didn't happen because the church organized some big program around it, then it's not church. That's not true. We are the church. And so when you do those things, it is the church doing those things with you. Right? So go and be God's people for the sake of the world. Love God, love neighbor, do it simply, do it intentionally, and see what God might do through those efforts. Let's pray. Gracious God, we